My name's Cindy Evans, and I'm currently a lecturer at a TAFE in Western Australia. And I was recently given permission to head over to the Powerchair Football National Tournament to work on the skills of classification. And I'm using this as my professional development. So, what is Powerchair football? It's a modified version of the game of soccer, and it hasn't been modified very much. But the modifications that have been made now enable people who have very complex physical disabilities to compete. The power chairs that people play with in national competition, they're sport-specific chairs. Not only are they designed for the sport of soccer, but they're also, of course, designed to keep those people with quite complex needs safe within them. So they're lower and they're longer. And one of the great things about these chairs is that they enable that athlete to turn at speed and to hit with force. Now that's a pretty rare thing for an individual who lives and works in a power chair. The game's played indoors on a gymnasium. It used to be played on a normal basketball court, but it's recently become bigger than that, so it's a slightly oversized court, and there's 4 people on each team, all of them in power chairs. The chairs, these are all pictures of the Western Australian members of the Western Australian Football Association. So in WA, we've only had power chair football for about 9 years. And this picture here of us all dressed up in Perth Glory colours, this was the first time in our history that we went over to a national tournament, and every single player in our team, apart from one, was Western Australian. It was a pretty great day. So what's classification? You can see what the Powerchair football is. Classification is the tool that the Paralympics use to make sure that every sport in the Paralympics has a level playing field. A level playing field meaning that the system that we use ensures that whatever athlete you are, when you line up to compete, you're competing against someone that you have the potential to beat. The difference, despite having very different disabilities, the only difference should be their training and how much skill they have. So to enable this, to put an athlete into a grade when they're raw, new and untrained is quite a skill. And so it's not dependent on one person. We have 3 qualified and trained individuals who will assess each athlete. And each of those individuals are have different fields. They're leading sports scientists or exercise physiologists, therapists, medical practitioners, or even sport-specific experts, so coaches. That's where that technical grade really wins through. Now, in Australia, we don't have very many classifiers. In fact, there are only 3 of us training it up, and we've only done our first international powerchair classification clinic at the Oceania Games, which happened just before COVID hit. So at that competition, we had trainees from Japan, Australia and New Zealand. And we had 4 international classifiers who came over to classify the athletes in that international tournament and to train us. So what's involved in Powerchair football classification? Well, there's 3 separate assessments that each athlete will go through. A medical assessment, where that the individual's muscle innervation, range and strength will be tested around different joints. The technical classification, where the individual will get in their powerchair and they will perform a number of sport-specific skills and drills that basically replicate the medical strength tests and range tests. The medical and the technical classifiers will look at the sports chair and see how it's been adapted. And then we'll watch how that individual moves in that adapted sports chair. And as a group, we'll decide what's their potential ability and what class should that individual play in. Now, these classes are very important because by having this grading system, the person with the most complex needs is just as important on that court as the person who has the least complex needs. So what's the difference between a medical classifier and a technical classifier? So important to note that many of the athletes that we're looking at have rare diseases, or they might be at the end stage of a progressive disorder. So both medical and technical classifiers in this sport are very experienced in working with people with complex needs and Powerchair athletes. But the medical classifier, their role is quite important because they're the people that are going to touch that athlete. They're going to do strength tests on every joint that's important to the sport of Powerchair football. They're going to put a bit of resistance on those individuals with rare disorders and complex needs. So they are people who usually do those sort of muscle tests in their everyday life, like a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist. I'm an exercise physiologist, not registered, but I can also do these tests. The other thing that a medical classifier is going to do is they're going to interpret any documentation that player brings with them, which is very important. The technical classifiers, they're going to use the rule book, especially around modifications to the chair, and biomechanical observation. That's observing that individual while they're moving. Now, the skills and drills that the technical classifier will ask the athletes to go through, they're all designed to confirm the medical tests that the classifier has completed. After we've looked at the chairs, looked at that player in their chair moving, gone through all of those medical tests, then all three of the classifiers will observe that athlete playing on court and make sure that what happened in the classification off court is replicated when the person plays in competition on court. So, medical assessment. The player brings in a whole lot of documentation that validates the fact that they actually require the use of a power chair in their everyday life. And then the medical classifier will assess their muscular innervation, their strength through the range, any neurological impairments in muscular innervation, and the active and passive range in that individual's joints that are important for the sport of Powerchair football. The technical classifier and the medical classifier will both work through the chair, but then the technical classifier will take that athlete through a number of sport-specific drills and skills designed to confirm our medical testing. Once those two components are finished, we have a very good idea about where that athlete sits in the competition, but we confirm that by assessing that individual during competition. So the sort of paperwork the individual is going to come in with, they're going to be things about their disease or their disorder or their disability. They're going to definitely tell us about what medications they're taking, the uses of those medications, and that's why a medical classifier is extremely important to interpret a lot of those that information. While drugs are allowed to be used, of course, some drugs are not. So like I said, main testing from the medical classifier, range of movement in those important joints for the sport of Powerchair football, muscular innervation, just how strong is that person through that range, and the strength assessments. Technical classification, we'll look at any modifications or any attachments that have been put onto that chair. Modifications and the way the person is seated and belted in, it tells the classifier a lot about strengths and limitations. And once we've looked at the modifications and attachments, that's when we get that individual to do some drills and some skills to assess what are the limitations and what are the strengths that individual has while they're playing. If we note any discrepancies, then we might bring that individual back into the medical test and do them again. The final section of classification, and the most important section of classification, is how does that athlete work on court? What is the true potential of the athlete? It's always shown when they're in competition. Competition observations, the player's always working their hardest. They're focused on the sport, and they're not scared in any way of what a classifier might be saying or deciding. So, watching any reaction to changes in direction, unexpected forces, interactions with balls and players, it should confirm everything that we saw in the medical and the technical tests. And if they're not, we might bring them back off and try those tests again. Why am I a classifier? Well, because for most of my life, since 1992, I've been working in the sector of complex needs. So in 1992, actually 1990, I started working with people with cerebral palsy who have complex needs. And when I got to New Zealand, I worked for the Cerebral Palsy Society of New Zealand for 12 years. Now, at university, I was a phys ed graduate. I did 2 streams. I trained elite athletes, and I trained and worked with individuals with autism and movement coordination disorders. It wasn't until I got to New Zealand that I really started working with people with complex needs, and I found that even though I'd done a master's and really looked at how do people acquire movement skills, when I watched someone moving with cerebral palsy, it was extremely difficult to understand what I was seeing. So I started classifying, because classification teaches you more about, or taught me more about, the way diverse bodies move than anything else. So I started off with swimming, and then I was national classifier in New Zealand for a number of different cerebral palsy sports. But in 1994 or 95, actually, I found wheelchair rugby, because one of the guys who used to come to my exercise classes with cerebral palsy started playing. And I worked for them for over 10 years as a wheelchair rugby classifier. And I was part of the team that changed that wheelchair rugby classification system from a very medically orientated system to a very functionally orientated system. At the Paralympics in Sydney in the year 2000, I got my silver wheelchair basketball accreditation. And then just a couple of years after that, I moved back to Western Australia, where it became very difficult to be part of classification at all. So in 2008, I retired from wheelchair rugby, but in 2019, I decided to go for the Paralympic Powerchair football classification, because it was just beginning. I certainly hope that I will be part of that team that makes this classification system much more functional as well. So the reason I made this PowerPoint, to thank my work for supporting me to go to this professional development opportunity, and I'm sure that the players will thank you too. I certainly hope they will. And just as a final, I just want to say these are some of the aspects of professional development that I'm going to get a lot out of. So I'm an anatomy and physiology lecturer. I find going to a classification tournament, it just makes my skills better, and it makes me a better lecturer to be able to speak about some really interesting and diverse matters while I'm teaching anatomy and physiology. Of course, Powerchair football, great for improving my skills at medical terminology, and that just makes me a much better teacher. 2 of the biggest units I teach these units in about 4 different qualifications, are communication and diversity. And classification is, it's very important that the individual who is a classifier knows how to be a skilled communicator. Sometimes we have to say to athletes, I'm sorry, but you do not qualify for this sport. And if they've never been able to play any other sport, that's quite a blow. Explaining to coaches why their athlete, even though they don't look like they have that potential, does have that potential, and they have to be put up into that higher grade, you know, that takes skill and excellent communication. So I think that As far as communication and diversity are concerned, Powerchair football classification is an excellent tool for my professional development. I teach individualised support, primarily disability, but also aged care. And of course, this sport, well, that's all about that, isn't it? The other thing that I get a lot out of when I go to classification training is my increasing in my knowledge around medical equipment. A lot of these individuals with rare diseases, and especially people with muscular dystrophy, sometimes their equipment is amazing. And if you don't get to go to an event where lots and lots of people are, you're quite unlikely to see equipment like that being used. So I find these classification clinics to be so amazing to improve my knowledge of medical equipment and how it's used. So that's me, Cindy Evans. I'm a medical classifier and a technical classifier, but only a trainee for this sport.